All right, are you all ready for this Snare Saturday? Because I'm pretty sure the person that came up with the phrase you have to pick looks or sound when getting a drum came up with it after they saw this drum. And this drum is so ugly. How ugly is it? It's so ugly that even though they're known as being some of the greatest sounding drums of all time, the looks killed off the series. Yo, what's going on everybody? Nick Costa here, and in this Snare Saturday video, I'm pretty excited because this drum rules, and you're gonna get the opportunity to hear a Peavey RadialPro snare drum. As a matter of fact, it is the Peavey RadialPro 1000. So you're gonna get the opportunity to hear one of these really unique looking drums, and you're gonna get the opportunity to see if this interesting looking drum per se does have a really awesome sound. Now, before we dive into this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell icon. That way you're notified of any additional content that I upload to the channel. So if you are a musician, then you are familiar with Peavey Manufacturing. They were known as being a more affordable product that was basically bulletproof. This is why if you walk into any school setting, especially from the 80s and 90s, you're gonna find Peavey all over the place. And we're talking amplifiers, to speakers, to even instruments. So let's talk a little bit about the history of the Peavey Radial drum series. Now, Peavey released these drums in 1994 at the NAMM show and put everybody on their head because it was the first time that the company was diving into drum making. And they featured this thing known as the radial bridge system. So you have this radial bridge design that requires no drilling of the shell, and the bridge itself is taking on all that excess weight and force to allow the shell to resonate as much as possible. Now, there were three lines of the RadialPro series: the RadialPro 500/501, the RadialPro 750/751, and the RadialPro 1000. Now, a RadialPro 500 snare drum was a steel shell and had two independent radial bridge systems on the top and the bottom. Those radial bridge systems were made out of a composite material, unlike this one, where it is one solid piece in the middle. Now, the RadialPro 501 snare drum was a wrapped hardwood shell, but once again had the two independent radial bridge systems on the top and the bottom that were made out of a composite material. Now, the RadialPro 751 snare drum was a 6-ply shell. Now, the RadialPro 1000s were originally called the RBS-1. Now, the radial bridge system was constructed of a solid piece of maple when these first came out. At least that's what I've read. Now, just like old 3-ply drums way back in the day that had solid maple reinforcement rings on the top and the bottom, this solid maple ply radial bridge was designed to keep the drum perfectly in round. Because all of those vintage 3-ply drums from back in the day are a really thin veneer on the inside and the outside, either mahogany, maple, or a combination of the two. And then that middle ply is poplar, and it is super thick. This is also the reason why a lot of people are saying that they like the sound of poplar shells. Because at the end of the day, those vintage drums, the majority of them were poplar, because those veneers, again, super small. Now, this radial bridge was turned on a lathe and it produced a ton of waste. So when the RBS-1 became the RadialPro 1000, it went from a solid piece of maple to a block construction. And this was simply to just reduce the cost of manufacturing. And that's exactly the construction of this particular drum. Now, this whole radial bridge system was from 1994 up until 2002. So let's go ahead and talk about the specs of this particular drum. Like I just mentioned, it is a RadialPro 1000 and it is a block maple construction. Now, this radial bridge in the middle is double-sided. And this drum is a 16-lug drum, meaning that it has 8 lugs on the top and 8 lugs on the bottom. Now, additionally, the drum is equipped with triple flange hoops. And being that this is the mid-90s, most likely they are 2.3 millimeters. There is a possibility, however, that they are a little bit thinner. Now, the really interesting thing about this drum is that it has 2 snare throw-offs. It has one on each side. And you will find out in a little bit that this drum is actually pretty sensitive. Now, when I received this drum, it had a top head that was way past its prime. A Remo Power Stroke 3 coated, and it looked like it had a reinforcement center in the middle. Now, the bottom head was the original RadialPro head that came with the drum. Now, I know this drum probably isn't from 1994 because of the fact that it is block construction, but if it was, that would mean that this bottom head is over 30 years old. Finally, the snare wires, they look like those generic snare wires that you'll get that have that made in Taiwan stamp on them. Seem like pretty run-of-the-mill snare wires. So the first thing that I did with this drum was put brand new heads on it. And of course, I outfitted this drum with my preferred snare drum heads, which is a Remo Ambassador X coated on the top and an Ambassador snare side on the bottom. And this drum, for the age, is in really good shape, so I just had to clean it up a little bit. Now, I decided to keep the stock snare wires on the drum because I wanted you all to hear what this drum would sound like just with brand new heads, but with all of the components that it originally came with. So, just like every other Snare Saturday video, I'm gonna play this drum through a few different tunings. I'm gonna start out in a low tuning and work my way up to a higher tuning. So, enough of me talking. Let's dive in. Now, the first thing that I noticed with this drum is that in those lower tunings, this drum sounds a little bit more like a symphonic snare drum. I don't know if it's because it has 2 snare throw-offs on either side of the drum, and it's not going to make that like a super sensitive because the wires aren't going past the edge of the shell. So it could be because of this drum being made out of a block maple construction that is pretty thick, or it's because of the radial bridge system doing what it's supposed to do, that the shell is just really resonant. Also, one thing you all didn't hear is that when I got this drum to one of those lower tunings I usually do with the Snare Saturday series, it was so resonant that it sounded like this. And I don't think that's a sound that really anybody wants because it's bleeding into everything. Now, although I said that these drums didn't last the test of time because of how ugly they are, the other reason why is that they're not very durable. So if you're touring with these things, a lot of people were running into problems. But they sounded so great. So what ended up happening? They ended up being in studios. Because in studios, you're not moving them around like you are when you're touring. You can set them up, you can mic them up, you can play them. They're not really taking as much of a beating. Now, one thing to point out with the tuning, once I got that low tuning that you heard, not the one that resonated for about 30 days, but the one where I actually played the drum. To get to the next tuning, I just did a half a turn on each tension rod of the top head. Just like every other snare drum, I tune that bottom head to a tabletop tension. That way I can get a nice snappy response of the snare wires. Now, once I did that half turn, I took one of the tension rods as my reference and went around to the others to pitch match them. Now, I did not use any type of tuning device like a tune bot or a drum dial. I just used my ear. And one thing I do have to point out with this drum, when I was getting into those higher tunings, it was getting a little bit harder to turn those tension rods. Now, it could be the construction of the drum. It could be a high probability that that tension rod is starting to bottom out because I don't really know how far they drilled into this radial bridge system, or it could just be that the drum is old. But it didn't matter that I put white lithium grease on everything. Still having a difficult time. So there is a possibility that you don't have a broad tuning range with this drum, like say a more modern drum. But either way, I would love to get your feedback and what you thought of this drum, so make sure that you leave it in the comment section below and let me know which tuning you like the most. Now, if you have any other additional questions, like maybe how I was tuning the drum beyond what I explained to you earlier, maybe even the gear that I am playing, or anything else, feel free to leave that in the comment section as well, and I will try my best to answer them. Now, if you want to see some of the earlier videos from the Snare Saturday series, I put a link to the playlist in the description below, and I'll also have it come up right here to make it a bit easier for you. Finally, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure that you give it a thumbs up. That way it makes it a little bit easier for others to find it, and just by doing so really helps the channel. Now, if you would like some additional ways to support the channel, I have some affiliate links in the description below, which would not include where to purchase a RadialPro because they're not in production anymore. So you are going to have to scour the used market. But it does include my preferred drum heads of choice, an alternative top drum head, which I should have put on this drum to control it a little bit more, as well as some accessories that I think you should check out that don't break the bank. And that is it. Thank you so much for checking out this video on the ugliest snare drum ever made. And until next time, see you later.